Amenhotep III's son inherited the wealthiest empire Egypt had ever built. Within a generation, he would try to remake the very gods that empire was built on, and set in motion a slow unraveling that no pharaoh, however powerful, would ever fully reverse. At the height of its power, Egypt seemed eternal, an empire of gold and granite that had already outlasted every rival civilization in the Bronze Age world. Then a single pharaoh tried to abolish nearly every god Egypt had ever worshipped in favor of one alone, plunging the state into a religious civil war it never entirely recovered from. A generation later, an entire interconnected system of Bronze Age superpowers, Egypt included, came under attack from mysterious raiders whose origins are still debated by historians today. An onslaught so severe it helped end civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean within a matter of decades. Egypt survived, barely, only to spend the next 1,000 years in a long, uneven twilight, fractured by its own priesthood, conquered by Nubians, Assyrians, and Persians, briefly reborn under a Macedonian conqueror's dynasty, and finally extinguished not by war, but by the quiet arrival of Roman tax officials. This is the story of how the oldest continuous civilization on Earth finally, irrevocably, came to an end. Amenhotep IV came to the throne around 1353 BCE, inheriting an empire at its absolute material peak, vast tribute wealth, an unmatched military reputation, and a priesthood of Ammonius at Karnak so wealthy and politically entrenched that it may have rivaled the crown itself in landholdings and economic power. Rather than working within that system, the new king chose to attack it directly. Within a few years of his reign, he began elevating a previously minor solar deity, the Aten, represented not as a human or animal-headed god but as a simple sun disk with rays ending in small hands, above all other gods in the Egyptian pantheon. He changed his own name to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, abandoned the traditional capital, and built an entirely new city from scratch in the desert at a site now called Amarna, dedicated exclusively to his new religious vision. Temples to Ammonius were closed. The god's name was chiseled out of monuments across Egypt, in some cases even out of Akhenaten's own father's inscriptions, wherever it appeared. Traditional Egyptian art style, static and idealized for over 1,000 years, gave way under Akhenaten to a strange, elongated, almost expressionistic new royal aesthetic, visible in the famous images of the king with his wife Nefertiti and their daughters shown in intimate, unusually naturalistic domestic scenes. Modern Egyptologists remain genuinely divided on how to interpret the Amarna period, whether Akhenaten's religious reform reflects sincere spiritual conviction, a calculated political attack on an overmighty priesthood, or some combination of both, and this uncertainty is worth stating plainly rather than resolved in favor of a tidy narrative. What is clear is that the reform did not survive its creator. Akhenaten's reign left Egypt's foreign policy in the Levant badly neglected, based on the anxious diplomatic pleas for military help preserved in the Amarna letters from Egypt's vassal rulers there, many of which appear to have gone unanswered. And almost immediately after his death, the religious revolution he had imposed by force began to be dismantled. His young successor, a boy king who had originally been named Akhenaten, changed his name to Tutankhamun, reopened the temples of Ammonius, and returned the capital to Thebes. Tutankhamun himself died young, for reasons still debated by researchers who have studied his remains, and it fell to a subsequent line of non-royal-born officials and generals, culminating in a former army commander named Horemheb and eventually a new dynasty founded by another general, Ramesses I, to fully restore traditional Egyptian religious and political order, including a systematic, often brutally thorough campaign to erase Akhenaten's name and memory from Egyptian history, a program of damnatio memoriae so effective that Akhenaten's very existence was essentially unknown to modern historians until 19th-century excavations at Amarna rediscovered it. The 19th dynasty that followed, and particularly its most famous ruler, Ramesses II, represents in many ways the last great flourishing of New Kingdom imperial power. Ramesses II, who ruled for roughly 66 years in the 13th century BCE, fought a massive, inconclusive battle against the Hittite Empire at Kadesh in Syria. A battle Rameses's own monumental inscriptions describe, with characteristic royal self-promotion, as an overwhelming personal triumph, though the surviving Hittite record and the battle's actual strategic outcome suggest something closer to a costly draw. What followed that battle is, regardless of who truly won it, one of the genuinely remarkable documents of the ancient world. Roughly 16 years after Kadesh, Ramesses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III concluded what is widely considered the oldest surviving peace treaty in world history. Its terms preserved in both Egyptian hieroglyphic and Hittite cuneiform versions, establishing mutual non-aggression, an extradition agreement, and even a mutual defense pact against outside threats. Ramesses filled Egypt with monumental building projects on a scale not seen since the Pyramid Age. The great rock-cut temples at Abu Simbel, vast additions to Karnak and Luxor, and his mortuary temple at Thebes, the Ramesseum, projects so extensive that later Egyptians would apply his name, somewhat indiscriminately, to monuments he never actually built. But even as Ramesses II's long reign projected an image of unshakable stability, the wider Bronze Age world into which Egypt was so thoroughly integrated was approaching a systemic crisis. In the decades following his death, a wave of destruction swept across the eastern Mediterranean with a speed and scale that still challenges historical explanation. The Hittite Empire, Egypt's former rival turned treaty partner, collapsed entirely. Major cities across the Levant and Anatolia were destroyed, some never resettled. Mycenaean Greek palace civilization disintegrated. Egyptian sources under Ramesses II's successors, particularly Merneptah and Ramesses III, describe repeated invasions by a loose coalition of seaborne raiders and migrating peoples that modern scholars refer to collectively as the Sea Peoples, a term that is itself a modern historiographical convenience rather than an ancient ethnic or political label, and one that continues to generate real scholarly disagreement, since Egyptian sources list several distinct named groups whose origins, whether from the Aegean, Anatolia, or elsewhere, remain only partially understood. Ramesses III claimed, in inscriptions at his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, to have decisively defeated these invaders in a massive land and naval battle around 1175 BCE, and archaeological evidence does suggest Egypt survived the crisis that destroyed so many of its neighbors relatively intact, at least in the short term. Though the broader causes of what historians now call the Late Bronze Age collapse, whether primarily climate-driven famine and drought, systemic economic breakdown, internal rebellion, or the Sea Peoples themselves, remain a genuinely unresolved and actively researched question, with most current scholarship favoring a combination of overlapping stresses rather than any single cause. Egypt's survival, however, came at a steep and lasting cost. The empire in the Levant that Thutmose III and Ramesses II had built was essentially gone by the end of Ramesses III's reign, its trade networks and tribute income disrupted or lost entirely. Internal Egyptian sources from this period record the earliest known labor strike in recorded history, tomb workers at Deir el-Medina, whose wages and grain had gone unpaid due to strained state finances, downed their tools and marched on royal temples in protest, an extraordinary piece of evidence for both the depth of Egypt's fiscal crisis and the surprising leverage even non-elite workers could exercise against the state. By the time the 20th dynasty ended around 1070 BCE, Egypt had once again split into a familiar pattern: a nominal pharaoh ruling from the north, and, in the south, the high priests of Ammonius at Thebes exercising what amounted to independent, hereditary religious and political authority. The very priesthood Akhenaten had once tried to destroy, now effectively co-ruling the country his descendants' dynasty had fought to restore. The centuries that followed, known to Egyptologists as the Third Intermediate Period, saw an Egypt fractured, foreign-influenced, and increasingly at the mercy of outside powers, even as its cultural and religious prestige remained remarkably durable. A dynasty of Libyan origin, descended from mercenary soldiers who had settled in Egypt generations earlier, took the throne in the 10th century BCE. Later, in the 8th century BCE, Egypt was conquered outright by kings from Nubia, ruling from the kingdom of Kush far to the south, who saw themselves as restorers of authentic, traditional Egyptian religious practice against what they viewed as centuries of northern decline. A striking historical irony, given Nubia's long history as an Egyptian dependency and conquered territory in earlier eras. This Kushite or 25th dynasty rule was itself ended by a still more distant power, the Assyrian Empire, which invaded Egypt twice in the 7th century BCE, sacking Thebes so thoroughly in 663 BCE that the destruction was still remembered centuries later, referenced in the biblical book of Nahum as a warning to the city of Nineveh about the fate that could befall even the mightiest of cities. Egypt regained a measure of genuine independence under the 26th or Sate dynasty, which skillfully balanced alliances with Greek mercenaries and traders against the looming threat of the expanding Persian Empire to the east, a threat that finally materialized in 525 BCE, when the Persian king Cambyses II conquered Egypt and incorporated it as a satrapy, a province, of the vast Achaemenid Persian Empire. Egyptian rule was restored briefly on more than one occasion through native rebellion over the following century and a half, but Persian control was re-established each time, until, in 332 BCE, an entirely new kind of conqueror arrived. Alexander the Great, who took Egypt from Persian control with minimal resistance, was reportedly welcomed by Egyptian priests as a liberator, and, according to later biographical tradition, made a famous pilgrimage across the desert to consult the oracle of Ammonius at the Siwa oasis, where he was, by some ancient accounts, greeted as the son of the god himself. Alexander founded the city of Alexandria on Egypt's Mediterranean coast, though he departed Egypt shortly afterward and never returned before his death in Babylon in 323 BCE. In the chaotic division of Alexander's empire among his generals that followed, one of them, Ptolemy, secured Egypt for himself, eventually declaring himself pharaoh and founding a dynasty of Greek-speaking rulers who would govern Egypt for the next 300 years. The Ptolemaic dynasty represents one of history's most successful examples of cultural fusion and calculated dual identity. Ptolemaic kings and queens were, in their Greek-facing public image, thoroughly Hellenistic monarchs, patronizing the famous library and museum of Alexandria, corresponding with the wider Greek intellectual world, and, notoriously, adopting the ancient Egyptian royal practice of sibling marriage to keep power within the family. Simultaneously, in their Egyptian-facing religious and royal imagery, they presented themselves in full traditional pharaonic regalia, patronizing Egyptian temples and religious institutions in a conscious, deliberate strategy of legitimizing foreign rule through the visual and religious language of 3,000 years of prior Egyptian kingship. The last, and by far most famous, ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty was Cleopatra VII, whose reign in the 1st century BCE coincided with, and was ultimately destroyed by, the terminal power struggles of the late Roman Republic. Cleopatra's political alliances, first with Julius Caesar and then with Mark Antony, were sophisticated attempts to preserve Egyptian independence by allying with the dominant faction in an increasingly Rome-dominated Mediterranean world, rather than the purely romantic entanglements later popular tradition, and centuries of subsequent art and literature would reduce them to. When Antony and Cleopatra's combined forces were defeated by Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE, the outcome effectively sealed Egypt's fate. Both Antony and Cleopatra died by suicide in Alexandria the following year rather than be paraded through Rome as captives, and in 30 BCE, Egypt was formally annexed, not as a conventional Roman province governed by the Senate, but as the personal property of the emperor himself, administered by an official directly answerable to Augustus, a reflection of just how strategically and economically vital Egypt's grain production had become to feeding the city of Rome. With Cleopatra's death, 3,000 years of continuous native and foreign pharaonic rule, stretching back to the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BCE, came to a definitive end. Egyptian temples continued to function for centuries under Roman rule, and the last hieroglyphic inscription, carved at the Temple of Isis at Philae, dates to 394 CE. A quietly remarkable fact, meaning that the gap in time between that final hieroglyphic inscription and our own era is shorter than the span of time separating that inscription from the construction of the Great Pyramid at Giza. The pyramids that opened this story were, to the priest who carved that final inscription, already more ancient and more mysterious than they are even to us today. Egypt's civilization did not end in a single catastrophic collapse, but through a long, repeated cycle of crisis and reinvention. Climate failure and civil war, foreign occupation and liberation, religious revolution and restoration, invasion after invasion after invasion, each one absorbed, survived, or eventually succumbed to, until the last independent voice of pharaonic Egypt fell silent, and the civilization that built the pyramids became, at last, purely a subject of history rather than a living, breathing state. 3,000 years after the first stones of Giza were raised, and nearly 400 more after the last hieroglyph was carved at Philae, Egypt's pharaonic civilization did not vanish in a single moment of catastrophe. It ended the way it had nearly ended a dozen times before, gradually, unevenly through the accumulated weight of climate, conquest, faith, and empire, until, at last, there was no one left to carve the old gods' names in stone. What survived was not a kingdom, but a memory so vast and so deeply carved into the world's imagination that, for 100 years after Rome finally silenced it, we are still trying to read what it left behind.